All right, there's our bell.
All right, there's our bell.
It's good to see everybody here. Is this on? Yeah, I think it is. We're going to be in Job chapter 29. Thanks for being with us in class, online, and appreciate everybody tuning in. I think we're having a little bit of. I was looking at my phone and it's lagging a lot. I don't know if it's just my phone or what, but we maybe. I know we're having some internet slowdown issues tonight, so hopefully this will be not. Just please bear with us. We're doing the best we can. We're going to start in chapter 29. Before we get started, I wanted to say a couple things. Friday is our scheduled night for the teens and the young adults. We're going to cancel that this time, so we'll meet in two weeks on Friday. This Sunday at 4 starts the class that we're doing, and it's starting this Sunday. So if you can be here at 4 o'clock for the study thing, if you want to be a part of that, I'd love to have you. And also, I don't know if I think I sent out an email to everybody. If you're interested in doing the Tuesday evening, it's a 6 o'clock class I've been doing on Genesis. Please let me know or check your email and sign up for that. We have a Facebook group. We have an email group, and love for you to be a part of it. What I'm doing is we meet together, and I send out questions a week in advance or a few days in advance of the next chapter. We're reading through questions in the chapter, and we're having a discussion group at Tuesdays at 6. And in the meantime, I'm sending out emails of different articles and things that relate to it, devotional topics, that kind of thing, and it'll be growing as we go. So I think it'll be beneficial to you. It is for me. I'm enjoying it so far, and we're 2 chapters in, so it's not like you're very far behind if you want to be a part of that. Also, thank you very much to everyone who's expressed sympathies and talked to me about my father passing away. We really appreciate all the prayers and text messages, and it's been a crazy week for us. There have been a lot of things that happened that I never thought I'd ever see, but that's just how things go sometimes. People are asking about the funeral, and we've actually had to kind of change all of our plans, and we're moving the funeral to it's going to sound strange, but this is necessary, to an undisclosed location and time, just for my immediate family. And so that's something that has to be done. And so if you're planning to come, I appreciate that very much. If you're planning to send flowers or something like that, we're simply asking you if please to send a donation to Medina Children's Home. I think they're called Arms of Hope now. You can find them in both ways. That's something that was very dear to my father, I know, at one time. So if you'd please send it that'd be great. And other than that, I think we're doing okay. We've gotten a lot of food, and I really appreciate it. And in fact, I'm thinking, man, I'm going to have to find another refrigerator somewhere. So we have plenty. Appreciate that. We just got some more this afternoon, and we looked at each other and said, we're going to have to eat a lot just to put it somewhere. So thank you very much for that. Let's go ahead and go to God in prayer, please. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful that you are a Father. We thank you that you've taken such good care of us. Lord, as we come before you to that in class, we pray that you will help us to understand you better, that we'll understand ourselves, we'll understand how we should view reality. Lord, as we approach you on a daily basis, we pray, Father, that you'll continue to bless us and continue to pour out the love upon us that you always do. We thank you so much for those things that you provide for us. We thank you most of all for your son Jesus and the sacrifice that he made, that we can have the right to call you Father, that we can have the remission of our sins, take away the guilt, and we have the hope of heaven one day. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, so chapter 29, we have moving into more of Job's final speech. And he's kind of going into what kind of an era or a period of nostalgia. And this isn't uncommon, of course. And a lot of times mourning will bring this out of people. Sometimes just simply age will bring this out in people. But certainly we can understand and we can relate to it. It accompanies mourning. It's a part of the acceptance process. And you see, we need to understand that Job wasn't just mourning his children, though he was. He didn't mention them a lot, though, did he? He wasn't mourning the loss of possessions or the loss of his health. He's also mourning the loss of his own life. And that is really seemed to be weighing him down, especially in this chapter. And so it's perfectly normal, especially as you're reaching the end of life, that you would look back and mourn the loss of those things, because we can understand that. And this is exactly what's happening to him. He has no reason. Well, it's not been told him that he's going to make it through. He has no reason really to even suspect that he will make it through this, even though he will, and everything will be great again. He doesn't know that. And so he assumes he's dying because, consider where he is, right? He's sitting there with pieces of body falling off because he's so sick, and all the problems and the decay and the worms and the stench and terrible things are happening here. And he can then assume that he's dying. So it says, Job further continued his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness." All right, so now it says that he watched. He's longing for those months before where he watched over him, when the lamp shone upon his head. That's the idea of God being there, that he was living in light and he didn't have any darkness over him. Job probably understands that a little better now, what that protection meant, right? One of the things that stands out to me is that when Job is longing for the good old days, he understands now what God was actually protecting him from in the past, that these things didn't happen to him in the past. He wanted to go back to those good old days right there. And sometimes we don't really understand what actually God is protecting us from. There's someone made a comment one time that I've taken to heart. It says, I thank God for those things I don't even know about that he's protected me from. It's an interesting thought. It's not, I don't think we should walk around being paranoid, but at the same time, we ought to recognize that there are things that we probably could be going through that we're not, and God has chosen to bless us. And you may say, well, there's no proof that that's actually the case. That's true. We don't know that, but it is possible when we consider that. And here he's looking back. He knows what it was like before, and now he sees what's happening. God has taken away his protection from him, obviously. And he could have, before all this happened, the mindset that he had is very likely going to be just like his friends. And we've brought that up before, that his friends believed he was being punished because of sin. And before he was being punished, he probably believed the same thing. So have you noticed that sometimes life the things that happen causes you to understand that there's a lot more complexity than we realize? And sometimes things are very complex, and we try to make them as simple as we can. And their idea of simplicity was to simply say, good blessings, bad punishment. And Job probably had the same mindset. Everyone did. But now he realized there's a lot more complexity here in life than what he thought before. But he walked in light, even in the light of God, even when in dark times, he still had God on his side. And this is what kind of mindset do you suppose that is? So you have, maybe that's too broad of a question. Do you see how his mindset was before all the punishment, that he considered that to be, he's walking, even in hard times, God's still blessing him because of who he was, because of his relationship with God. Things were going well. He's longing for those days, right? But he knows that that's not true anymore, even though he hasn't done anything wrong. Nothing has changed in his life as far as his character is concerned, right? He's still the same person. but things are definitely not going the way they were before. So he's kind of longing for those past days of saying that God was with him. Now, does he think that God is with him right now in this circumstances that he's in? It doesn't seem like it, does it? He's saying, I just want an audience with God. So he's abandoned. God has abandoned me to this, right? And well, now I need to rephrase that, because there are indications from some of the things he said in previous chapters that he does think God is there, but God is there simply to inflict pain on him. He has said that, and he doesn't understand it. He knows that there may be good reason for it, perhaps, but he doesn't understand what that reason is. And so he wants an audience with God to just let up. Remember, he would say things like, can't you just let me take a breath? Can't you just give me a moment to swallow my own saliva? He said those kinds of things because he thought God was there, but God being with him is a completely different idea now than it was months prior to this. So what has changed? The circumstances have changed. And because the circumstances have changed, now his attitude about who God is and what God is doing has completely changed as well. And so now he's struggling to understand who God is and why this is happening, that kind of thing. So he says in verse 4, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. He sees, like I said, he sees the years past when he was in his prime, and he thought of those great times of joy, great times of peace and glory, because he had the friendly counsel of God as part of him. And he says in verse 5, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me, when my steps were bathed with cream and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. And the picture being painted, of course, is one of life it was great. Everything was going well for him. And even the rocks poured out oil for him. I mean, and oil represents riches. Of luxury. This kind of the cream that he mentions here will be luxurious. The creams that came from the steps. Everywhere he turned, things were good for him. And this probably was something that his friends experienced as well. This is the reason that Job had every confidence that he would have been right with God. His friends the same way, every confidence. And now we've learned differently, of course, that we don't. Remember, as I've said many times, our blessings from God are no indication of our standing with God. And our trials that come in life, even from God, are no indication of our standing with God. So things may be going really bad, but that does not indicate where we stand with God. Things may be going really well, but that does not indicate what our standing is with God, because things can go really well and still be in sin. Things can go really poorly, like with Job, and still be righteous. So we have to remember to keep that mindset as we go through this. And one of the other things about this in verse 5, this is one of those rare times he actually mentioned his children. He says, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me. He remembers back to those times that he could see the children playing around his knees, right? These are the little children around me. And he's looking at those years as the best times of his life. He says in verse 7, when I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square. All right, what is a reference when he talks about a reference to the gate and the open square? What is that referring to? Is anyone? Places of honor, right? So this relates to the towns, and they wouldn't have town halls. They would have the city gates. That's where the elderly men would sit together, and the rulers of the cities would sit at the gates, and they would make their proclamations, and they'd have their decrees, and they would have their discussions and about the city and how things would run. So this is a reference to that. He says in verse 8, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged rose and stood. Okay, what does that mean? Why would the young men hide from him? Sorry. Okay. You can kind of see the parallel passage, the parallel section of this is the aged arose and stood. Okay, what does that indicate? A high amount of respect. He was respected in the community, in the town, and the children would hide from him because he was in high respect and high regard, and so they didn't play around him. The princes refrained from talking and put their hand on their mouth. Wow. All right. So these are royalty, or as much as royalty they had at that point. That these are the ones who were inheritors of the government. They had high respect for Job, and it's possible that you can look back and think more, but I have no doubt from the way his friends are acting, the way he behaves, that this is absolutely truth. He says in verse 10, the voice of nobles was hushed, their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. So the important people of the city, when he was talking, they let him have free reign to talk. When the ear heard, then it blessed me. When the eye saw, then it approved me, because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless, and the one who had no helper. Now we're getting into the reason he had such a high amount of regard in where he lived, and that is the righteousness of the way he lived. It wasn't because of his power. It wasn't because of his riches. He says, verse 12, he delivered the poor and the fatherless who had no helper. Verse 13, the blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. Okay, there's a reference to, this actually is what we call a figure of speech, a synecdoche. A synecdoche, I think is how you say it. All right. And it is a figure of speech in which something is replaced. Here in this case, we have the result that is replaced, or the activity that's replaced by the result. So when he said, we have the blessing of a perishing man came upon me, it wasn't that he was walking around asking for blessings from perishing men. It was that he did things for this perishing person, and they blessed him because of it. So the result is actually being put there instead of the activity that he did. The same thing with the widow's heart. He led a life that would cause widows to sing for joy. What could that be? That he's helping them, right? He's there for them. He's doing what he can for them, and he caused them to sing for joy. He put in verse 14, I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. So now he's saying he has righteousness, that is right living, right? This is what he always lived by. And same thing with justice. In this case, we're talking about justice in the sense of seeing someone who is in need and helping that person in some way. Okay. He said, I was eyes to the blind. I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor. I searched out the case that I did not know. I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. So here is a man. It's a good man, right? And he's saying, this is how I was living whenever I enjoyed all these great blessings and benefits from God. And I wish I could have those kind of days yet, because God was with me, everything was going well, and this is the life that I was choosing to live. He wasn't squandering it. He wasn't looking at his life and saying, I've got all these blessings, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. He was using those in a way that helped other people. And they praised him because of that. Then he, in verse 18, he said, then I said, I shall die in my nest and multiply my days as the sand. My root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lies all night on my branch. My glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. So he was sure that because of the way he was living, that he would continue to have peace and prosperity in his life, right? Now, what does that indicate about what his thinking is, about his mindset, about the prosperity that he was enjoying? Can you see a connection here? Sorry? Yeah, he's positive about what the future holds, which he was wrong about, by the way. But what was the basis of his positivity of the future? Yeah, he did all these great things. And of course, since I'm living this way, I'm going to continue to have prosperity the rest of my life. You see that? So he's admitting that before all these things happened to him, he was living a life that was full of prosperity. He had every reason to think that he was going to continue the rest of his days. He's going to have full enjoyment. This is 18 through 20. He says, I will die in my nest, multiply my days as the sand. I'm going to live a long time, and I'm going to die among family. Right? That's what he means, I think, by dying in his nest. His root is spread out to the waters. What does that refer to? What does that mean? He's going to be sustained, right? If you got a tree that sends the roots out to the water, it's doing that for nourishment. If you go back to Psalm 1, for example, this is same imagery is used about the tree that's planted by the waters. Remember that? It's going to grow strong and it's going to produce fruit, and it's going to be bountiful. He says, the dew lies all night on my branch. He has everything that he needs. He's living in peace. In verse 20, his glory is fresh within him. His bow is renewed in his hand. He has everything that he needs, and everything he wants basically is his. Why? Because of this is how he's been living. Now, his friends had the same mindset. They thought the same thing about themselves and Job. And this is why it's so troubling for his friends to see Job in this condition, because it doesn't make sense to them. What has Job done to cause? They have to figure out that he's done something, because they believe the same thing. If you do well, you'll continue without any failure. So this is bringing that out even more in this section. Okay, 21 through 25 begins talk about the respect that he had in the city before. He said, men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. After my words, they did not speak again, and my speech settled on them as dew. So in other words, he had the last say, because everyone respected him so much. When they asked his opinion, there was no rebuttal, there was no argument. It's like, okay, I'll go do that. And they just left it because they respected him so highly. They waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouth wide as for the spring rain. If I mocked at them, they did not believe it, and the light of my countenance they did not cast down. I chose the way for them and sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts mourners. All right, he doesn't necessarily mean that he was a king, although he could have been. We actually do have, there's some people that believe that Job was actually a king of I think from Edom, named Jobab. And some people say this is a proof of that. It's possible, but it doesn't necessarily say that. He's simply saying, I lived as a king. Everyone took counsel from me. And whatever he said, everyone loved to do. So he definitely had great prosperity and great influence. And why was that? Because of the life that he lived. Everyone looked at him and saw how great he was. So that's a very important idea here. And he's establishing then a fact that he was doing everything possible to ensure that these things didn't happen to him that he's going through. It's the exact opposite, right, of what he should expect. And that's because of the mindset that they have. And that's what chapter 30 is about. Everything now has changed in spite of that. So we're kind of getting the overview again of what happened. And this is drawing to a close. We're going to get into Elihu in chapter 32. But this is where we're almost there. And Elihu has a lot to say about both sides of this conversation. It's going to help us even more. And then, of course, what God says is going to be even more. In verse 1, well, before we move on, does anyone have any comments? Yes, sir. Yes. Very good. So Paul said that at the very beginning of this book, it talks about Job's righteousness and how he's his standing with God. And God said there's no one like him who's blameless in this way. And this gives us an indication of what he was really like. It wasn't that Job was just a good old guy. It was that Job was living a life full of righteousness and justice. And he was looking for opportunities to help people. And he was even sacrificing daily for his family, right? And just in case, on the off chance that they did something wrong. So he was a very good man. And there's nothing in there that showed any change in his character. Not at all yet. Nothing has changed in any way except for the fact that he actually can't help anyone at this point, but he would if he had the opportunity. Very good. Any other comments or questions? Chapter 29. All right. Chapter 30, verse 1. But now they mock at me, men younger than I, whose fathers I disdained to put with the dogs of my flock. Well, that's a big change. We have he was once held in high respect, but now he's mocked and ridiculed. And the people who are mocking and ridicule him were the children of people whose fathers he wouldn't even hire. These are people of low repute. And so now he's not being mocked just by people who were of the same kind of quote unquote class as he was, or the same kind of righteousness as he was. Though he was being mocked by them, his friends were mocking him. He's being mocked even by the lowest of society. People he wouldn't even hire to be with his dogs are mocking him. He didn't even. So this shows how far he's actually fallen. In verses 2 through 9, he talks about these people, the children of these people that are foolish, who are mocking him. He says, "Indeed, what profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. They're gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late to the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the bushes and broom tree roots for their food. They were driven out from among men. They shouted at them as at a thief. They had to live in the clefts of the valleys, in caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes, they brayed. Under the nettles, they nestled. They were sons of fools, yes, sons of vile men. They were scourged from the land." So these are the kind of people, he says. And now in verse 9, "I am their taunting song. Yes, I am their byword." So the lowest of society now looks at him in derision and mocks him and makes fun of him. So you can't get any lower than this, is what he's saying. We also discussed, obviously, there is no way that unless you have this may be a bold statement, but there's no way unless you have this hierarchy that we've talked about before that has developed in the world at this point. That's the only thing imaginable that I can think of that would someone else's face. That is, they're so far beneath them that they can spit on them, that they deserve it. And remember, we talked about that, this hierarchy. If God is here and the angels are here and the planets are here and God is he judges his angels and even the planets, as he stated, then where are we? How are we to expect to have anything good from God? But there are people who are better. So there's people who are worse and even worse than that. So there is a hierarchy that they've kind of arranged for themselves. And, it's interesting that the ones who created that hierarchy are the ones who are in the top of the hierarchy, right? That's how it works. We've kind of arranged it. It's kind of the good old boy collection. We help each other out because we're good boys, because we have the same things. We have wealth, we have good things. And the people that don't have the same things, they don't need any part of this because they're obviously bad people. And the ones that are even worse, the ones who are the dregs of society, we've cast them out. They live out in the caves, weird places. It's obvious because they're such fools. They're so wicked. How do you know they're wicked? Look at where they're living. So that kind of mentality is not necessarily here, but it's all throughout this book. We've seen that over and over again. So here is, I think, an example of someone who could look at Job and think that it's okay to spit on him. And the ones who are looking at him to spit on him were actually what would be considered the lowest part of society, which is even more ironic. But there it is. In verse 11, he says, "Because he has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me, they have cast off restraint before me." Let me see the footnote here in verse 11. Does anyone have any comment about that statement? It says his. Yeah, that's true. Oh, is that what your translation says? Okay. It could be kind of related to that. And we've talked about that idea of the hedge before because Satan complained that Job had a hedge around him. But Job also complained that there was a hedge around him. They had two different concepts of that. But here, my footnote says that in some ancient translations, it says he loosed his bowstring and afflicted me, or loosed his cord and afflicted me. So the idea is that God has afflicted me. That's his point. God has afflicted me, and because he has afflicted me, they've cast off restraint. They do the same thing. They're spitting in him, deriding him, making fun of him. Why? Because if God did this to him, I have the right to do it too, right? Now, there's a lot of flaws in that thinking, but that's the way they thought. And we have to be careful. If we think that God is doing something to someone, punishing them, it might be tempting for us to think that we can lay insult to injury because God's doing it anyway. We might as well throw in with them. So we have to be careful of that. I'm glad you brought that up, though. The idea of the hedge and loosen the cord. I think it relates to actually to bowstring, but it could be that too. He's allowing them people to have free reign to do whatever they want to him. Then we talk about the rabble in verse 12, and rabble literally means young people. That's what the word literally is. He says, "At my right hand, the rabble arises. They push away my tent. They raise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as broad breakers. Under the ruinous storm, they roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud, and now my spirit is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me." And we ought to ask, why are these things happening? They rise up against him and cause him to fall. And that indicates that other people evidently have been troubling him. He's mentioned this before. Remember, he mentioned that even the young children, the children who are not even old enough yet to have animosity, because it says it's literally young children, little children were going up to him and making fun of him. So there are a lot of people here. He wasn't by himself. People making fun of him, deriding him, saying terrible things about him. It could be that it's metaphorical about his demise. It's so pathetic that even, people mock him and terrorize him. But I think it actually probably was happening, that he was adding insult. They were adding insult to injury. And then in verse 17, he says, "My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pains take no rest." So this is again, he hasn't said this in a while, but this is a reference to the pain of his disease. And he's talked about his bones being on fire before, inflammation throughout his body, have pieces of his flesh falling off. There's scraping off maggots. I mean, it's hard to imagine what he looked like and what he was going through. It's not difficult to imagine it, but it's painful to imagine it. In verse 18, there's more than just his sores that was causing. He says, "By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as a collar of my cloak." It could be that he's having some kind of contortions, which would indicate that he's having severe. What comes to mind would be like, have you seen pictures of people with tetanus? That their muscles and things just contract and they have no control of it. They're contorting their body. He's in misery. And what does he get for it? Taunting, even people spitting on him, even the lowest of low, it's a terrible situation. And then verses 19 through 23, he turns to God, pleading for help. He says, "He has cast me into the mire. and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand, you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you'll bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. And he's just, I think he's asking for help. He wants God to stop being, doing these things to me. And remember, it sometimes feels this way. We go through life. But remember, the advantage that we have in this discussion is we see the beginning and the end, right? We understand there's more going on here, and he has a glimpse of that, and he's talked about that. But it's still, he has no other way of looking at it than the fact that God's doing this. In 24 through 28, he talks about his severe disappointment in God and what God has allowed to happen. He's mourning his losses still. He says, surely he would not stretch out his hand against a heap of ruins if they cry out when he destroys it. Have I not wept for him who is in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and cannot rest. Days of affliction comfort me. Confront me, sorry. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand in the assembly and cry out for help. This is where he is. And he says, I'm the brother of jackals, a companion of ostriches. My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My harp is turned to mourning, my flute to the voice of those who weep. So he's obviously severely distraught. He's an outcast of society. When he mentions here jackals, I'm a brother of jackals, a companion of ostriches. These are creatures that would have been living outside of society, hiding from humans. That's kind of where he is right now. He's an outcast. And you can see why people would look at that and be afraid of what he's going through. He scared people. And all he can think about now is mourning and death. Wow. Positive things, right? But it's important for us to work through these and remember the mindset that is here. And Job may be going backwards. You can see positive things in his life that we've talked about earlier, positive ideas about mindset. I remember maybe 2 months ago, we talked about one of the things he did was he came to a realization that there's something more going on here. This is obviously not about being punished, because he wasn't being punished. We even talked about how he stepped even further at one point by saying that he recognized that there had to be a resurrection, that there's no other option. There must be a resurrection, because he knows God is just. And during that resurrection, he knows that he'll be able to stand with God. And he wants then the earth to remember, and he wants it to be engraved in stone with an iron chisel, all the things that have happened to him, so that can be brought up during that time that he's with God. And so these things he can be understood. He can talk to God and try to understand what's happening. So he never gets an answer, but he knows that one day he will. So he talks about the Redeemer that he knows is going to be there. So great things and growth. And then we also have times like this where it seems like he went backwards to the old mindset of, look at the things that I've done in my life. Why am I not being treated better than this? Do you see any parallels for the way we do things? I mean, I don't know about you, but growth, we want to be, let me see, be like this. We want to grow from here to here. It's a straight line, right? But it doesn't usually work that way. It's like this. And we have our ups and downs, and we take 13 steps back when we take one step forward. What does that mean? It just means that we're human beings, right? But we don't see the end. We don't see even really the beginning. We don't understand how things are working in our lives. All we know is what we're enduring. And so we need to remember that. And Job is going through this difficult time. It's hard for me, honestly, to read through this at this point. But I do know that we have a God who is going to help us, and it actually will help Job as well. In Job 31, he again goes back to his character. Again, showing why he's so confused, because he says, I've done so many good things. Why am I being treated this way? And it's a question we all have asked, right? Or we might have asked. Look at the things that I've done. Why should I have to go through this? And Job never gets an answer. He might, after his death, he might have gotten one. We don't know what it was. So now, maybe even for the benefit of his friends, he starts to talk about how he lived and the suffering that doesn't make sense. He doesn't want them to think that he's just complaining about God's punishment. He has legitimate right to think that things should be better because he hasn't done anything wrong. And as I said before, it doesn't mean anything. Just because things are going good in your life doesn't mean you're not going to suffer. And we all know that. In fact, since we're out of time, I'm going to stop right there. We got 5 more minutes. But think about what Jesus said about suffering. What do we know from the New Testament about Christianity and suffering? What's the likelihood of it? Sorry? All of us will suffer in some way. We're going to suffer persecution. If we're faithful to God, we will suffer in some way. We'll suffer. I don't know what that's going to be. There's no guarantee. In fact, I've said this before, but what is the guarantee that Jesus gave? I just said it, didn't I? The only guarantee that we have in life as a Christian is that we're going to suffer. That's the only promise God ever made about this life, except for I'm talking about, whether or not we suffer or have great things. God never promised us that we'd have riches and blessing. Certainly, in a way, he did promise that. I don't mean that he didn't promise the blessings, but he didn't ever say that our life was going to be all good, right? It's all going to be all positive, right? He never said that at all. In fact, he did say that we should take up our cross daily and follow him, right? And that's the mindset that we should have. And I think about that. I think about what God allowed to happen to Jesus. And I think, why should I expect any different from me? If that's what he expected from his son, why should I expect any different from me? And then I look at the apostles, the ones who are actually the closest to Jesus of anyone who is ever on the earth. Jesus himself chose these 12 men to be at his side to train and teach. And every one of them suffered enormously. Why should I expect that I would be better than that? And the only answer is I shouldn't. I should expect the same things. And it seems like the closer we get to God, now, again, we have to be careful with this, but it seems like the closer we get to God, the more we can expect to have pain and suffering. However, we don't want to look at pain and suffering as a badge or an indicator that we're actually doing what is right. Right? It doesn't mean that we're right with God just because we suffer. But if we are right with God, we can expect to suffer. It's like a man I told you about who went door knocking, and he would knock on doors and he would get in arguments with people as soon as they opened the door to ask them where they go to church, and he'd start insulting their religion, trying to get them to change their mind and come and become a Christian. And he would argue with people heatedly until they slammed the door. And when they slammed the door, he would come back after everything was over, he'd come back and say, brothers, I was persecuted for Christ. And I would just shake my head because he wasn't he saw persecution as an indication of righteousness. He was not persecuted because he was a Christian. He was persecuted because he was a punk. There's a big difference. But if we are persecuted for being Christian, what does that tell us? That we're in good company, right? Now, does that mean, why in the world would somebody become a Christian if they're told that that's how they're gonna react? It's not about this life. Remember, it's all about the next one. And sure, we have great blessing. And even during persecution now, we have the fruit of the Spirit. We can have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all those things that are listed there in Galatians chapter 5. Those are ours, and we can have them as much as we want. There's no limit to those things. But they always will come with persecution. They always will come with some pain in our lives. And it's not going to be constant. That's the good thing about it. It's not constant pain, but even if it were, which one, if you throw it out and you lay it out for us, two options, two roads. One, a 70, 80 years of bliss and fun and feeling good, or 70 or 80 years of torment and pain, maybe even 30 years of torment and pain. But on the other side of the first, you have hell. On the other side of the other one, you have heaven. Which one would you choose? You can go to heaven. As Johnny Ramsey used to say, I love this statement. He says, you can suffer immensely in this life and go to hell, or you can suffer immensely in this life and go to heaven. Which one do you want? It's a great question. And it's all about what we choose to look on. So too many people I've run into that says, things are going well, I think I'm going to give up God, as if that's going to make it better. How could that make it better? I actually ran into a man that says, you know, he actually said this. He said, God caused me to have pain. It was some kind of death in his family. So I decided I don't want to believe in him anymore. I was like, well, that'll show him. He's still alive. Whether you believe in him or not, he's still there. And we're going to have a time where we're facing him. I would much rather, I did say this to him. I said, do you think it's better to try to appease someone who wants to destroy you? Or do you think it's better to try to make angry someone who's going to destroy you? I think it's better to at least appease him. And of course, that's not even the basis of our relationship, but sometimes that's all people can think and understand. Going back to that kind of Old Testament mentality of I need to appease. Well, we appease God, certainly, but we have a relationship with God. We have a God who is actually full of love and wants to help us. Okay, well, I'm sorry. I didn't want to preach, but I did want to preach. So there we have it. Any comments, questions? All right. Well, that's the second bell. So we'll have about 5 minutes, and then we'll start our devotional.